Welcome back everyone to week number 2 of our Revit course here. So hopefully you guys remember from last week is what we went over. Okay, if not, please go back and review that, as those videos will be accessible to you guys all semester long. But last week what we did is we went over kind of the overview of the program itself, and we also went over kind of the settings and things you should be doing kind of before you start to model. All right. This week what we're going to do is going to start getting into some of the modeling. Okay, we're going to look at walls, all right, go through all the different settings and things we can do with walls, all right, and we'll also go through windows and doors as well. Okay, so we're not going to get super detailed into all the different things of modeling. All right, we're just going to kind of stick on windows, walls, and doors for this week. All right, from week to week, we're going to kind of take a little bit more each time, and dig really into the details so that way you guys understand how they work. Okay, so like I said, this week we're going to focus mainly on walls, and then we're going to hit doors and windows as well. All right, so from week to week is what I'm going to be doing, and you guys will be seeing in these lectures, is I'm basically going to be starting from scratch with a brand new project file. In terms of you folks and what you guys want to be doing, okay, you can certainly start from scratch like I am, all right, that way it might possibly be a little bit easier to follow along, right? Or what you can do is use the same practice file you did from the last week, all right, and just kind of build on top of that. Okay, so that way you have a little bit of something from last week to go off of, so you're not just starting fresh every single week. Okay, completely up to you. All right, it's more or less whatever is more comfortable for you guys. But again, as you'll see me each week, kind of opening up a new file and kind of going from there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start by opening up a new Revit file. So again, if we remember from last week on our recent files page here, okay, then I'm going to go ahead and click New Project. All right, make sure that project is selected here under Create New. And for the template file, and kind of from this point forward, all right, is I'm going to be using the architectural template. All right, just because that has more of relevance to what we're going to be doing for the class. Okay, for you guys, if you're either going to use the architectural template, or if from last week you want to use that custom template that we saved, all right, by all means do that. Okay, but again, that's completely up to you guys. But for what I'll be doing is I'll be using the architectural template. All right, we'll hit OK and create a new project. Okay, so now that we have the project open, all right, we should be familiar now with the setup here, all right, the ribbon and the properties and project browser, okay, where everything is. And so what we're also going to do is assume that we've already gone through and set up all of our settings that we want to do, okay? So everything we went over last week with going to the Manage tab and setting up everything for the project, right, we're going to already assume that we've done that, okay? So I'm just going to leave it as is for now, but like I said, if you're starting off with your template that you already started last week, all these are going to be done for you anyways, all right? So that's what we're going to assume, is that we've already gone through and set up our settings here. Okay, so we're going to start out today by going over walls, all right? And so walls within Revit, okay, are basically made up of 3 different wall types, okay, if you will. So if we go to the Architecture tab and we hover over Wall here and we click on the little arrow for the drop down, okay, you can see that you have Wall Architectural, all right, Wall Structural. Then you'll also see you have Wall by Face, which today we're not going to get into, but when we start to talk about massing, we'll get into how you can do that as well. All right, but essentially in Revit is walls are made up of 3 basic wall types, okay? Is you have your basic or your compound walls, okay, which are going to be your architectural walls, okay? So what your basic walls are just like they say, in the description of your basic wall is they're going to be your typical walls that you have throughout your whole building, all right? It's a wall, it has multiple layers, multiple materials, multiple thicknesses, okay? And we'll go through that in detail in a little bit. All right, your next kind of wall that you'll have is called a stacked wall. Okay, now what a stacked wall is is, again, we'll go over it later in this class, but it's essentially two different types of these basic wall types, and they're stacked on top of each other. Okay, so they're kind of connected from top to bottom. All right, and again, we'll go over and show you guys, exactly how we make those and how they're used. All right, and the third kind of wall is a curtain wall. All right, and so the curtain wall is more or less, in Revit, it's a wall based on a grid system, okay, and using the panels and the grids for mullions and glass and things like that, okay. But that's kind of the third type of wall, okay. And what we're going to start out with today is going to be kind of our basic wall, all right, and kind of look at the different aspects with those, and then we'll kind of move on from there, okay. So what we're going to want to do is, the first thing is click on the architecture tab, all right, and under the wall tool, we're going to go ahead and select wall architectural, okay, to open up our wall tool here, all right. And much like we mentioned last week, right, the modify tab changes to the green here, and under the green section for draw, right, you can see these are all the different methods we can use to draw walls, right. So aside from just a single line, okay, you have a box, you have, polygon, circle, and so on, okay. So you can definitely draw walls in multiple ways, okay. Now with a basic wall, all right, I mentioned it also being called a compound wall, right, and the reason why I call it a compound wall is because it's made up of multiple layers, okay. Now, if you think of an actual wall in a building, there's multiple layers there. There's the structural piece, right, whether it's the, wood stud or the metal stud, or, some concrete masonry units that are inside, all right, and then you have all the finished layers on the outside. Okay, so basically a compound wall or the basic wall is a typical wall that's made up of multiple layers, all right. Now, what you can do within a basic wall, all right, is you kind of have two different types of walls. As you saw when you used the little drop down there for the wall tool, is that you had the option of an architectural wall and a structural wall, okay. Essentially the difference between the architectural wall and the structural wall is that a structural wall has settings that you can adjust to allow you to do structural analysis, all right. So there's visually no difference between the two of them, okay, but the structural wall, again, will allow you to do some structural analysis with it. So unless you're going to be using your model for that, there's really no need to ever model a structural wall. And I'll show you guys as well how you can kind of easily switch back and forth between a structural wall and an architectural wall, okay. But to kind of start off here, all right, is in the properties box, once we're in the wall tool, all right, so I want you guys to look on the very top here of our properties box, okay. And now up to this point, when we were doing grids and levels last class, is we hadn't really played around with this box on the top, right? But where it says basic wall generic 8-inch, okay? If we click on this, all right, it'll bring up a list of all the different wall types that we have associated in our project here, all right? So these are all the different types of walls that are created by default here within Revit when we start it up, okay? Now, depending on, the template that you guys used when you opened up this new project, right, you may have more, you may have less, okay? But essentially these are all kind of the default wall types, all right? And each one of these walls has different layers, has different materials, and so on, okay? What we're going to do for purposes of this is I'm just going to scroll to the top of the list here, and I'm going to select this wall type that says exterior brick on CMU, okay? And so I'm going to click on that. All right, so this is the wall that I'm going to be kind of generically drawing here as an example, okay? Now you don't need to pick this exact one. You can go ahead and pick whatever wall type you'd like. I just picked this one because it has some layers that are already set up for us, all right? It'll give us a little bit more something to look at when we walk through it, okay? But essentially what we're going to want to do here, all right, is once we have our wall type picked, all right, we want to go ahead and set up the different options to model this wall, okay? So one of the first things we're going to want to do is, you'll notice that just underneath our ribbon here again, okay, this little bar before we get to our screen is you'll have some options. All right, so whether you're looking here in these options, all right, or down in the properties bar, all right, because all of these options are going to be found down here in the properties as well. All right, well, the first things you're going to want to do before you model the wall, all right, is go ahead and set what's called the top constraint and the base constraint. Okay, now if you look at the properties box here, all right, is if you come down to the bottom here, as you can see, you have base constraint. Okay, now what the base constraint is that's telling Revit where you want the bottom of this wall to sit. Okay, so right here it's set at level 1. Okay, and by default, because we're in our level 1 floor plan, right, if you remember looking at your project browser, you can see which floor plan you're in. All right, because we're in level 1 floor plan, all right, is the base constraint set to level 1. So that's fine for what we're doing here. So the bottom of our wall is going to sit at level 1. All right. Now if you look down a little bit farther where it says top constraint, right now it says unconnected. All right. Now what this does is it tells Revit that, you know, the top of your wall doesn't have any sort of certain constraint with it. All right. And just underneath that you can see it has unconnected, but if you were to kind of drag this out a little bit more so you can read it a bit more, all right, you can see it says unconnected height. Okay, so basically this is telling Revit that there's no real constraint put on the top of it, but we want this wall to be 20 feet high. Okay, for purposes of what we're going to do here, okay, is I'm going to say and recommend that you're always going to want to constrain the top and the bottom of your walls, right? Okay, so now that we have our wall type selected, all right, let's go through a couple of the different settings that we want to set before we actually model this wall. All right, so you'll see just underneath your ribbon here, all right, as we mentioned a little bit in last class, is that you'll have some options depending on the tool you're in, all right, some of the settings that you can change. All right, these can also be found down here in the properties box. Okay, so for instance, location line, all right, we'll get into the location line here in a minute when we go through the different settings on a wall, all right, but if you drop down that location line, as you can see, you can change it from the wall center line to core center line, all right, between finish face and core face, right, exterior, interior. Okay, and again, we'll get into this in a minute when we go through the settings on the wall, all right, and it'll make a little more sense to you on, you know, what the finish face of the exterior and interior mean, as well as the core face. Okay, but essentially what the location line is based on is when you click and draw the line for this wall, is what part of the wall are you drawing along? Okay, is it the center line of the wall like we're set at now? All right, is it going to be the finish face of the outside of the wall, the finish face of the inside of the wall, and so on? Okay, so that's what the location line refers to. The next thing you're going to want to set is base constraint. Okay, so now when you're looking at a wall is going to have two different constraints. It's going to have your base constraint, and it's going to have a top constraint. Okay, now the base constraint is going to be where the bottom of the wall sits. Right, in this case it's set to level 1, right, whereas if we look at what floor plan we're in level 1 floor plan. Okay, if you're in level 1 floor plan, Revit's going to automatically default to setting that as the base constraint. Okay, now when you look at top constraint, right, in this case right now it's unconnected. All right, and for purposes of what we're going to do in this class is I'm going to tell you that you should always set this top constraint to a level that you already have defined, okay, instead of leaving it unconnected like this, and I'll show you why in a minute, okay, when we actually model this out. So if you change this here from unconnected to level 2, all right, so basically what we're telling Revit is we want our wall to go from level 1 and go all the way up to level 2, all right. You'll also notice the unconnected height here. All right, it kind of grays itself out once you change this top constraint. Right, that's basically because now that you've constrained it in the bottom and the top, all right, is you can't kind of type in your own height for the wall. All right, that's already predetermined based on what the distance is between level 1 and level 2. All right, and I'll show you how we can change that later, and you know how it relates to the different levels in your building and how they can move around. Okay. You'll also notice that you have these little offset values for the base constraint and the top constraint. Okay, this can come into play if you want to offset them from this base or the top. All right, so for example, if you wanted the bottom of your wall, all right, to start, 6 inches above where level 1 is defined, all right, or perhaps 6 inches below, depending on whatever you're doing for it, right, you can offset that value here. So if you wanted the wall to start 6 inches above level 1, all right, you can put in 6 inches here, and what Revit's going to do is it's going to say, okay, we're going to start at level 1, and then we're going to offset ourselves up 6 inches, okay. Alternately, if you put in a negative number here, it'll bring it down below, okay, and the same can be said about the top offset. All right, so those offset values work the same way, one for the bottom, one for the top. Okay. So for now, is go ahead and set the base constraint and the top constraint of your wall. Okay, and just draw one wall here, so we have something to work with for now. Okay, and we'll get into the settings with it. All right, so a wall is going to be drawn with 2 clicks. All right, one thing to notice as well when you start to draw is just underneath the ribbon here is this little checkbox for chain. All right, basically with this checked like this, it means that as you start to click and draw walls, all right, it's going to automatically, once you get done drawing one wall, it's going to automatically start the next wall for you. All right, so you're constantly building a chain of walls. If you uncheck this, it's going to draw one wall at a time, and you're going to have to re-click to start the next wall. Okay, so it's up to you on how you want to do that. But I'm going to draw one wall here. Okay, doesn't matter how large it is, but I'm going to click the first one. All right, click the second time over here to place it. All right, and you'll see because I have that chain selected, it automatically starts my second wall for me. All right, and because I want to just leave it at this one wall, all right, as I'm going to go ahead and back out of my wall command. So either by hitting escape or scrolling up here and clicking on that modify arrow. All right, so I'm just going to hit escape. Okay, it gets me out of that line. Okay, and hit escape again. It backs me out of the tool altogether. Right, so now I have this one wall here. Okay. So now that we have this one wall modeled, is we're going to want to select the modify arrow, select this wall. All right. And in the properties box here, okay, is we're going to go ahead and now look at the properties of this wall and kind of go through a little bit more of an explanation on properties. Okay, now with a wall in Revit, okay, this is kind of an easier spot to start than others, so that's why I decided to explain this now with the walls, right? It's an important kind of aspect to understand with Revit is the relationship between objects that you place in here and their settings, okay? So for instance, we start with walls, okay? Now, I'll be posting kind of a, an image up there, on Moodle for you guys to download and look at, so it's a bit more visual, okay? But this wall that we have modeled here, all right, is considered a wall type, okay? So, for instance, if you look in the properties here, all right, you can see this says basic wall and then exterior brick on CMU, okay? That's the type of wall that this is. Okay, and by that I mean is that it is a type of a family, all right? And I know we'd kind of briefly talked, or at least mentioned families last week, all right? So we're going to get into a little more detail today, all right? But if you think in Revit as everything that you place in your model, all right, whether it's a 3D object like a wall or something you load in like a window or a door, right, or everything down to the 2D details like dimension lines, window tags, door tags, things like that, all right? All of that stuff that you end up putting into your Revit model, all right, is considered a family, okay? And so if you can think of kind of a tree structure here, right? And again, I'll post this image so it's a little bit easier to visualize, all right? At the very top of our tree structure, we have family, all right, kind of as an overarching thing. And now families are basically going to consist of, let's say for instance, basic wall, right? So walls are a family, all right? Windows are a family, doors are a family, okay? So these are kind of the very basic, higher level categorization of just things that we place in Revit, okay? Kind of the next tier down from families, all right, is what's called types, all right? Or they're called family types. Now, so if you can think of walls, all right, as we're using this as an example, All right. If you think walls in general is a family, all right, within Revit is the next step down are family types. So each within walls, right, if you use this little selector here, right, which is called the type selector, is all of these here, all right, that are listed are wall types. And so that's kind of the next step down on that kind of tree that I've been talking about, all right, is that you have walls at the very top, and then the next step down are wall types. So these are kind of how walls are defined a little bit more, right? So you have, brick on CMU wall, you have the brick on metal stud wall, all right? And you're gonna have all of the different wall types that you define yourself as well, all right, that are put in here. But again, it's kind of the next step down in terms of this tree structure we've been talking about, okay? So again, we have walls kind of as an overall top of the tree structure here. The next step down is wall types. So it breaks it down a little bit more and says, okay, these are all the different types of walls we have, okay? And kind of the third and last step on that tree, all right, are called instances, all right? And so, like instances suggests, is instances are each individual object that we model in here, okay? And so this single wall here is considered one instance, all right? If I was to model a second wall here, that's considered a different instance. So if you have two walls modeled here, you have two different instances, okay? And so if you think of that as the very bottom of the kind of tree structure, is you have instances, which happen to be, the single one-off piece that you've modeled. You go up the tree structure, so you have two different instances here, right, that I end up modeling, is, for visualization purposes, is why don't I go ahead and model, okay? So now I have two walls here, right? Two separate walls, you can select them individually, right? So these are two separate instances. But if you select them, you'll notice that the wall type here is they're the same wall type, okay? So if you go up the tree structure, they're of the same type, but they're two separate instances, all right? And if you go up the other layer of the tree structure there, is that they're of, the same wall type, and they're also all considered walls, okay? So it may be a little bit confusing just talking through it right now, okay? But like I said, I'm going to post that kind of image of the tree structure that I'm talking about, so hopefully you guys get a better understanding of it, okay? You don't need to necessarily know it, piece for piece, exactly how the whole thing breaks down, all right? But it's important to kind of have a general understanding of it when we start to talk about the next part here, which is the properties between a wall, okay? So if we select one of these walls here, okay, knowing that each one of these walls is considered an instance, okay, is we've been looking at this properties box here and saying, okay, we're changing this around, these are all the settings that we can change for the properties, okay? Now, when you start to select different walls, all right, or different objects, this property box changes, okay? And the reason why this property box changes is because these properties here are called instance properties, okay? And they're called instance properties because these are the properties out here that you can adjust that affect this single object that you have selected, okay? So for instance, if I go and I change the base constraint and the top constraint for this wall that I have selected, all right, it's going to change this wall I have selected, but it's not going to affect this one over here, all right? Because these settings here only affect this single instance that I have modeled, okay? And like I said, it's important to know that because, as you're going through here, if you have a bunch of walls and you realize you have to change the height of them later, all right, is you have to go kind of through each individual one and change the height of them, okay? And so if we scroll down here, aside from just the base constraint and the top constraint, okay, and kind of scroll down a little bit in your properties box, all right, we can see some of the other instance properties that we can change around, all right, room bounding. Now right now that doesn't come into play where we haven't done rooms, but when we get into actually placing rooms, all right, it's a good idea to have that checked. Okay, that way these walls will define kind of an enclosed room. All right, so where I was talking before, where you can model, these architectural walls or structural walls and how you can change them back and forth. All right, this little checkbox here essentially is all you really need to do to change this wall from an architectural wall to a structural wall, okay? And so like I was saying, is really the only big difference between them is that An architectural wall doesn't have the ability to change any sort of structural settings to it, right? But if you were to check this box off, you can see that you go and it actually brings up some more options on how you can adjust the settings here for this. So, the structural usage, enable the analytical model, things of that nature that, again, if you're going to be using this model for kind of structural analysis, you're going to want this checked off, okay? But for our uses, we don't need it, all right? And again, that's not going to visually change anything with your wall. It's just the information portion that kind of lives inside of it, all right? You notice dimensions here, all right? You're not going to be able to change these manually. These kind of update depending on what the length actually is, and the area and volume and everything, updates automatically depending on the size of the wall. All right. And the stuff at the very bottom here, identity data, is everything that you'll find in the identity data, all right, whether it's a wall or a door or a window. This stuff is purely informational, all right? So anything that you go and place in here under identity data, in this case there's image, comments, mark, okay? This stuff will not change the way that your wall looks. All right, this stuff was only pieces of information that you want to store inside of this wall. All right, now with walls, it doesn't really come into play too much. All right, but if you have like a door or a window, all right, you'll notice that some of the identity data you'll have is manufacturer and model number and things like that. So that's the kind of stuff that you might want to store in the identity data of a window or a door. And again, it kind of just gives you that one more layer of information that you can store within your model, right? So you'll be able to click on any sort of window in your whole model. You can look at the property and say, okay, that is, a Marvin window, this is the model number, so on and so forth, okay? But again, it doesn't change the look of your wall at all, all right? The last part here in the properties box for the instance properties is the phasing, right? We're not going to get into phasing in this class because it's just a little bit more complicated, and we're not really going to have time for it, all right? But you can change the phasing of individual walls in your project, all right? If you decide you want to go in and start playing around with the phasing, all right, by all means you can do that. If you end up getting the textbook that I have on the syllabus there as a recommended textbook, I believe they have a section in there that walks you through phasing. Okay, so you may be able to look through that and kind of learn on your own and play around with it. Okay, but again, we're not going to be getting into it in this class in particular. Okay. All right, and so those are the instance properties for a wall. All right, so now if you go and click, on this wall here, all right, select this second wall that I have modeled, all right, you'll see that the properties are the same, but again, if you were to make any changes here, all right, in these properties on this in this box here, all right, it's only going to affect this one single wall. All right, it's not going to affect the other one. What we can do though, all right, is if we take one step up from, the instance properties, okay, and we click on this button here on the top where it says Edit Type. If we click on that one, it opens up a different set of properties. All right, and as you can see from the type here, or the top of the box, right, it says type properties. Now, again, this is taking the next step up on that kind of tree structure we were talking about, right? And these are the properties that are associated with the wall type, okay? So, as I was mentioning, all right, the exterior brick on CMU, that's the wall type we have here, okay? And so now, if you think of these settings here as changing the settings for the wall type, okay, that means that if we change anything in here, right, so for instance, we'll get into the structure here in a minute, but any of these settings, okay, if you make any changes here, this is going to change everything for this wall type, so brick on CMU, which means that every wall that you have in your model, okay, that is modeled as brick on CMU is going to change along with these properties, okay? And so, for instance, under our structure here, if we change, the thickness of the wall in our type properties, okay, that's not only going to change this wall that we have selected, right, but it's going to change every single wall we have modeled in the project that is a brick on CMU wall, okay? And it's important to remember that and kind of get that into your mind and how that works, because a lot of times what people will do on accident, right, is if they're not familiar with it, is they'll come in here and say, oh, this wall here on top, I actually want to change this, and make it a little wider or make it a little skinnier, anything like that. And they'll just click on the wall and go into here to the structure and change it and say, okay, I'm going to change my layers up. Well, if you do that and you're not paying attention, all right, is you may have not only this top wall that's modeled as this brick on CMU, but depending on how far along in your project you are, you may have 5 other floors that have 100 other walls that are modeled that are the brick on CMU. And by just clicking one and changing the structure of it, you've now just gone through and changed the structure of all of those walls, okay? And you're, again, if you weren't aware of it, you've just gone and made that change and may have screwed up other parts of your building, okay? So it's important to know that when you're in your type properties, that you're changing properties for every single wall that's modeled of brick on CMU. Okay, so every single instance that you have modeled here, in this case I have the 2, they're both brick on CMU. So if I make a change in here, it's going to affect not only this wall on top, but it's also going to affect this wall here, because they're both the brick on CMU wall. Okay. Now that being said, if you're going to make any sort of adjustments in here to the type properties, all right, and it's something where you don't want, every single wall modeled as a brick on CMU to change, okay, is you have the button on the right here to duplicate. Okay, and this kind of process is, I can't stress enough, is you want to duplicate every time that you want to make a change here in your type properties. Okay, now the reason I say duplicate every time is because more than likely, all right, is you usually make changes here kind of as a one-off. All right, so you're kind of going and modeling through and realize, okay, actually this top wall here, I want this to be a little skinnier, and you go in here and change the structure around, right? And usually most people will forget to duplicate the type, and as I mentioned before, it'll go and change all of the walls to that. Okay, so if you get into the habit of coming in here and saying, okay, I need to change something in my type properties, but stop for a second and think, okay, am I making a change in my type properties? Do I want it to affect all of those walls, or do I only want it to affect this single wall or something, this single wall here and maybe a couple others, all right? And if it is an instance where you only want to change a couple of the walls, right, you're going to want to do duplicate. Okay, and what duplicate does is, if you click on that, all right, it's basically going to make a copy of this wall type. All right, so you see exterior brick on CMU2 is, we'll just go ahead and leave it that for now, all right? But I recommend, if you're duplicating your types, rename them something logical, all right? So that way when you're looking through it, your list of walls you have, you're going to be able to remember exactly, what that wall is, all right? Don't name it something like, in my case, George's favorite wall, because, if you're going through and you've been working on this project for, 2 or 3 months, by the time you go back to George's favorite wall, you might not remember what that wall actually has into it, all right? So if you keep it something simple that explains what the wall is, in this case, brick on CMU, it's, you're more likely to remember what goes on in it, all right? So if we hit OK with the name, you'll see here under type, it now says brick on CMU2, all right? So we know that we've duplicated it, and now any of the changes we make in the top here, okay, they're only going to change the brick on CMU2 wall type. Okay, it's not going to affect any of the other walls in here that are made, that are modeled as a brick on CMU. Okay, so we know that the rest of our project is safe, essentially. Okay, so now once we've gone and we've duplicated our type, all right, is we can scroll down here through the rest of the settings that are considered type properties. All right, but before we get into each one of those, is the most important part with a wall, at least, is where it says structure. Okay, so if we click on the little edit button here with structure, we're going to bring up this box that says edit assembly. All right, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger for myself so we can read it a little bit easier. All right, and what I'm also going to do before we get into each one of these is, on the very bottom left of our box here, if it's not up already, is click on preview. All right, and basically it gives you a little preview of what your wall looks like in either a plan view. All right, on the very bottom here, you can change between floor plan or section. All right, so if I want to change it to section, all right, I can go in here and navigate and kind of zoom in just like I would on a regular view. All right, so again, you can kind of get a sense of what it looks like in a section. Okay. Now, in the assembly of our wall, all right, this is where we tell Revit, okay, Revit, this is our wall type, brick on CMU2. These are the layers of materials that make up this wall, okay? Now, within this class, we're not going to get into, you know, this is an exterior wall and these are the correct layers and the correct thicknesses and everything that's supposed to be going into, you know, a wall. You know what I mean? That's not what this course is going to be getting into, all right? The details of what a wall actually is made up of, okay? But it's important to understand how these layers go into each other within Revit, okay? Especially the part where we're selecting materials for them, because, you know, we're gonna have to go through and actually add materials and layers in, regardless if, you know the correct makeup of the wall or not, okay, for purposes of, you know, sections and details and renderings and things like that down the road, okay? But essentially what we have here for our assembly is this little box here, starting kind of on the left column, is, you can see we have function, right? You have material, thickness, right? Wraps and structural material we'll get into as well, okay? But what this does is it lists out every single layer that we have within our wall type. All right, so our brick on CMU2 wall type, all right, again, that we're gonna mess around with, and it won't matter, it's not gonna screw up anything else in our model because we duplicated it, all right? But what we're gonna do is, you know, if you start at the very top here, you'll see you have exterior side, all right, where it's kind of labeled on the top, and at the bottom it says interior side, right? So when you're thinking of a wall, you know, the outside of the wall, inside of the wall, okay, that's how you kind of denote which side is which. So everything towards the top here, that's going to be exterior material on the outside, right? The one on the bottom here is going to be the interior side. Okay. You'll also notice these two gray bars that kind of come all the way across here, which are labeled as core boundary. Okay. Now the core boundary within Revit, it kind of tells Revit, you know, what the kind of structural layers, or the kind of, you know, what Revit calls the core of your wall is, all right? And generally it's made up of whatever layers are going to be kind of the structural pieces of your wall. For the purposes of what we're doing here, is it's not super important that you know exactly what layers go into the structure, all right? And what layers are, technically speaking, supposed to go inside of the core. Okay, but what is important is that you understand the relationship of the core boundary here to the rest of the wall. All right, so any of these layers that are inside of these two gray bars, right? So in this case, it's only one, you know, this structural layer, the concrete masonry units that are 7 5/8 inch thick. Okay, this is the layer that Revit considers to be the core of the wall. Okay, now if we had another one of these layers, all right, inside of these gray bars. Okay, so for instance, if you select one of these other layers here, and just for visual purposes, right, if you look on the bottom here, you can move layers up and down. If I move this one up, all right, Revit now considers both of these layers to be the quote-unquote core of your wall, all right? So again, you don't necessarily need to know, you know, this concrete masonry unit layer should be in the core of the wall or anything like that, but just take note of, you know, where the boundaries are, and that anything inside of these gray lines is considered the core of the wall. Anything outside of the core boundary lines is considered the finish of the wall. All right, so everything to the top of this core boundary here, so these 4 layers, is considered the exterior finish. Everything underneath this here is considered the interior finish, okay? And that'll come into play when we talk about our location lines, all right? Because if we remember, when we dropped this down, you had the option to be, you know, the finish face of your exterior finish face of your interior finish, you know, and you also had the ability to pick core boundary interior and core boundary exterior, right? Which is basically going to refer to the gray lines here. Okay. So again, the technicalities of what goes inside the core is not, uh, a big deal and important to know. What's important to know is just how the wall and how Revit defines the makeup of your wall, is what's inside the core here and what's outside of your core. Now, if you wanted to make a new wall type and every single one of these was inside the core, doesn't really matter. All right, that's fine. Revit's still going to make your wall for you, and it's still going to look exactly the same. It's just when Revit goes to calculate, what's inside the core of your wall, it's going to consider all of these layers inside of the core of your wall. All right, so visually speaking, it's not going to make a big deal. And again, depending on how detailed you want to get into the makeup of these walls, all right, the layers that actually fall inside the core boundary, probably not going to make a big deal, right? But again, it is there as another layer of information you can put within Revit, and it's important just to kind of know the relationship of it, so that way, a couple of different things that refer to the core of your wall, you know what Revit's actually referring to. All right. So aside from the core boundary here, all right, the first column for function, right, you can see that each one of these layers is called out as a different function. So the middle one here says structure, right? You have membrane layers, thermal/air layers, as well as finishes, all right? And you can drop down the little list here and see all the different types of functions you can select, all right, for each one of these layers. Now this is another part of the assembly of your wall that doesn't really need to be completely accurate, all right, is if you wanted to go through and every single one of these layers, as you can call it, a structural layer or substrate layer, something like that. Revit doesn't really care visually, all right? It's still going to show the wall up the same exact way, okay? When Revit does care is if you're going down into the level of detail to tell Revit, this specific layer here, this is going to be my structural layer, this is going to be my thermal/air layer, all right? And whether or not you're going to get into that kind of a detail, okay? Again, you don't have to if all you're going and doing is, making this wall for visual purposes so you can make, your drawings. You're probably not going to have to worry about what layer is doing what function, all right? The only thing you will have to note is the little numbers to the right of each function here. So where it says 1, 2, 5, all right, is these have to be in a certain order. So the lower numbers, so 1 for example, all right, has to be kind of in the middle of your wall, all right? So 1s are going to be towards the center of the construction of your wall, all right? As the numbers get larger, so 2, 3, 4, all right, you can see that they start to go towards the outside, all right? So just keep that in mind as you go and start to put different layers in here. So, a 4 can't be towards the middle, kind of inside of a 3, can't be on the inside of a 2, and so on and so forth, all right? Is the smaller numbers want to be towards the center of your wall construction, the larger numbers want to be towards the outside, all right? Again, if you're not getting into that much detail, you don't even need to worry about it, right? But if you are getting into that much detail, you'll notice that if you try and put, a finish 2, which is number 5, on the inside of a substrate, which is number 2, is Revit will probably pop you up with an error and say that the order is off and you have to change it around, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. But that's the function column. Right, the material column is pretty self-explanatory. This is, telling Revit what material goes with each one of these layers here, all right? And now today we're not going to get into, the details of our materials, okay? But if you were to select, let's say, this exterior finish layer here, all right, it says brick, common brick, okay? So that's the material that is going to show up as the exterior layer of our wall. If you were to select, this line item here and click on the little box to the right, okay, this should bring up your material dialog box, all right? Now, when you open up your material dialog box, all right, in your material browser, is you can scroll through here on the left, right? You can see all the different materials that Revit has already created for you, okay? And like I said, for the purposes of today, we're not going to get into, kind of duplicating and creating new materials and going through all your different types of settings for it. All right, we'll get into those in more detail in a later class. But if you do want to change around, the material of whatever layer it is, right, you can scroll through here and select any of the material you want. Okay. In terms of what we might want to do for the class today, right, is the graphics tab here. This is where you can change the color appearance of it, surface patterns of it. Okay, the cut pattern is going to refer to the pattern that shows up in either a section, all right, or in a plan view when you look at that. All right, so for instance, this brick right here, that's the pattern that's showing up, is the cut pattern. So when that material gets cut, right, what hatch pattern shows up for you. Okay, and so you can play around with those in the graphics tab. All right, again, there are these other tabs here for your materials. We won't get into them today, but we will in a future class. Okay, and so you can change your materials around if you feel the need to. All right, I'm just going to leave it as brick. All right, we'll hit OK and come back out. All right, so that's the material tab, all right, or the material column rather. The thickness column is going to tell Revit how thick this layer is. All right, so again, this gets into another part where we're not going to go and discuss this brick layer is supposed to technically be the 3 5/8 inch thick, and if you made this 4 inches thick or 6 inches thick or something, like, oh, that's technically wrong. All right, we're not going to get into that in this class. The only thing we're going to talk about in this class, as it relates to the thickness of your layers, is that if you change the thickness here, so where this is 3 5/8, all right, if you change this to something like 6 inches, all right, and let it go, as you can see in your preview on the left here, all right, that changes the thickness of that layer, all right, which will change the overall thickness of your wall. Okay, and so this is where you can change those layers around. So if I change that back to 3 5/8 real quick, all right, so you can see that changes back. All right, you'll see that you go and you add different layers here and different thicknesses for each one of them, and they all add together to create your overall thickness, which you'll be able to see at the top here, where this says it's 1 foot 7.5 inches thick. Okay, so that's the overall thickness of this wall. All right, so just keep that in mind as you're going through here and adding layers and taking them out and changing the thicknesses of them. Okay. Now, aside from just changing the thicknesses and using the layers that are already here, right, on the bottom you can see you have insert, you have delete. All right, so if you wanted to add an additional layer in here, if you hit insert, okay, it adds another layer in here. If you wanted to take one out and hit delete, okay, it'll delete one out for you. All right, so again, depending on the wall type that you want to play with, you can go and add or subtract any sort of layers in here. Okay. Also, when it comes to Revit, is you don't need to have in this case 7 or 8 different layers in here. If you really want to go and have just one big layer that is the full thickness of the wall, and some of the wall types in here have that, right, you can do that. Okay, but the idea that you come in here and add your different layers and change the thicknesses of them and the materials is the same idea that we talked about last week, that it's one of those things that you want to do as setup beforehand. All right, because if you come in here and put in the correct layers and the correct thicknesses and the correct materials, all right, and your wall type is, not only is it going to be the correct thickness, okay, but when you cut this in a section view, all right, you cut through your building in a section view or anything like that, you're automatically going to see the hatch patterns, you're automatically going to see the correct thicknesses and so on. So it basically saves you the time in drawing a section from having to go back in and draw in the lines for each one of these layers, all right, draw in the hatch patterns and all of that. Revit already does that for you if you go and select the correct materials and the correct thicknesses, all right? So it kind of saves you that step. And what it also does is, by selecting the correct materials and thicknesses and stuff like that, is down the road when we talk about schedules, is it will allow you to calculate out how much of each material you're using. So brick, for example, if we have a bunch of brick on our exterior walls, you can make a schedule and it can tell you exactly what the square footage is of all the brick in your building or something like that. Okay, so part of it is, again, visually, to make sure that it looks right, but the other part of it is that set this up, make sure that it's accurate as to what the makeup of the wall is. So that way when you do, detail views or you do sections, right, is Revit already does that work for you. All right, so why not take advantage of the fact that Revit does the work for you and just take a little bit of extra time at the beginning and make sure you add all of your layers in here. Okay. The next column here, wraps. By default, these are all going to be checked, and I recommend keep them all checked. All right. Right this second, I'm not going to get into what the wraps does because visually we kind of have to see it with the wall. All right, but we're going to want to keep these all checked. All right, and with the structural material, as you'll see that this layer here is checked off as a structural material. Basically, one layer in your wall has to be checked off as a structural material. All right, in this case, it's this one here. Again, if you don't really know what the structural layer is, you can just check off one of them, and it's not going to be a big deal if you're not using it for any structural analysis or anything like that. So don't worry too much about it. Just kind of know that you have to have one checked off. All right. So those are kind of the different columns here for the line items and the layers with our wall. Okay. Again, you can insert or delete any of these layers, change the materials, change the thicknesses, again, to kind of customize the wall type to whatever your needs may be. Okay, and so now that we have kind of our wall types here set up, with our different layers, as a couple of the different options on the bottom here. So default wrapping. Okay, this has to do with this kind of checkbox here. So at inserts and at ends, right now by default, they're not wrapping. Okay. I'm going to leave these alone for now, and I'll show you exactly what the wrapping feature is. Basically, if you have a wall that's kind of a dead end and it's not connecting to another wall, is whether or not these layers wrap themselves around the open end. All right. And again, I'll show you it here in a minute. But that's what these have to do at the end here. All right. And then these options, the modify vertical structure, is why you're in here. As you can play around with the structure of your wall in a section view. All right, that gets into a little more detail and a little more complication with adding different regions and sweeps and reveals on this wall type. We won't do it in this class, all right, but as you get to learn walls a little bit more, if you want to come in here and play around with this, by all means you can do that, okay? But for now, all right, once you've gone through and added any layers you want, change the materials around, change the thicknesses, all right, is we're going to go ahead and hit OK. Okay. And so that'll bring us back out to our type properties. All right, and so that's inside of our structure. Okay. So our structure tab is probably the most important part of our walls. All right, because that really tells Revit what the thickness is, what the materials are. All right, and kind of so on and so forth of really the makeup of the wall. Okay. Now, kind of the other parameters and options in here in our type properties. Okay, so the wrapping, again, I'll show you what the wrapping means in a minute. All right, at inserts and at ends. All right, function. This value, if you drop it down here, you can see that you have interior, exterior, or foundation, soffit, something like that. You don't need to change this to reflect exactly what this wall type is. All right, if you want to get into that level of detail, you can. Okay, but this is just kind of an information piece. This isn't going to change the way that your wall models, the way your wall looks. Okay, this is just kind of for information purposes only. Okay, graphics. So graphically, when you're at the coarse scale for your view, right? And we'll get into the changing the view scale, the view detail level in a minute. All right, but you can change the pattern and the color of it here. All right, you can see structural material, it's grayed out, okay, and you can't change it, and that's because you changed that inside here in the structure, right? If you remember that checkbox on the right. Okay, analytical properties. So if you are going to be doing some analysis with it, all right, you can fill in these options here. All right, so that way that you have the proper information for your analysis. And then under identity data, all right, this is really, again, just identity stuff that you can put in for your walls. All right, that it's just information. It's no has no bearing on how this wall looks or how this wall models. All right, it's just basically for purposes of whoever's using the model being able to select the wall and come in here and see additional information about it. Okay, so something like fire rating you might want to put in here, whether it's a 2-hour wall or a 1-hour rated wall or something like that. Okay. All right, and so once we're done here in the type properties, okay, is we're going to go ahead and hit OK. All right, and so we'll see now that this top wall, because this is the one we had selected, all right, as we can see that it's the brick on CMU2 wall type. All right, so that's our custom wall type that we just played around with. All right, if we click on this wall here, all right, the vertical one that I modeled, you can see that it's still the brick on CMU wall. Okay, so if we made any changes here, okay, to the thickness of the wall or anything like that, we would only be changing this wall. Whereas if I made changes here, all right, before I changed this one around and I didn't duplicate my type, we would have changed both of them. Okay, so again, just keep that in mind when you're making changes. All right, just be aware that when you're making changes here in the type properties, all right, this is going to affect every one of the walls of this type. All right, and make sure you want to do that if you're making changes. If not, be sure to duplicate. Okay, you'll hear me say that, in just about every week when we're doing modeling. All right, is make sure you duplicate the type. All right, I'm going to say it over and over because again, it's important to know. All right, that way you don't get yourself in trouble down the road when you're modeling. Okay. All right. So now that we have kind of one wall type here, all right, we've kind of made a custom wall type. All right, just to kind of visually show you guys how these type properties and instance properties change. All right, we'll do a little experiment. So right now we have two different wall types. We have the one we customly made with brick on CMU2. We have this one that's just a regular brick on CMU. Okay. What's nice with Revit is if we have this wall type here, right, and we wanted to change the type altogether, we can select it, and in the drop down here, we can choose any one of these walls, and it'll go and change for us. Right, so if we said that one, right, you can see that the wall type changes quickly and easily. All right, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to change it to the brick on CMU2. All right, so now these are both the same types of wall. All right. So if I go in, all right, to my edit type properties here, and for sake of visually showing this here, let's say I did change this to 6 inches. Okay. If I change that to 6 inches, hit OK, all right, and hit apply, you can see on the right that not only did this top wall change, but this one on the right changed as well, because these are both the same type of wall, and I made a change inside my type properties, which means both of these changes. Okay. So the fact that both of them changed when I made a change here in the type properties, that's the kind of thing that I want you guys to think of when every time you open the type properties and try and make an adjustment, is that this is going to change every single one of these walls of the brick on CMU2 wall type, right? So like I said, farther down the road, once you have a full building going, is if you're down on the first floor and you're making a change to a wall, right, you may have 150 different instances of that same wall type modeled all the way up through your building, right? You might have some up on the 5th floor, you might have some up on the 6th floor, as well as on the ground floor. Well, if on the ground floor you click on one of your walls and you realize, oh, you know what, on the ground floor, I want this one single wall to be a little thicker, all right? And without thinking, you kind of open up the type properties, go in the structure, change the thickness of it, right? And you changed it and messed around with it, right? And said, okay, well, in this case, maybe made it a little thinner and said, okay, apply, okay, perfect. My wall's thinner now, and we're looking at it on the ground floor. What you've just done is not only changed it on the ground floor, but you've also changed that wall type on your 5th floor and on your 6th floor and everywhere else in your building that has that wall type. All right. And so without even realizing it, it took you 2 minutes to go into your properties and change it. You might have just accidentally screwed up a whole bunch of work that you've done, without even realizing it. Okay, so that's why, like I said, it's important to get the idea of what type properties are, all right, and what the instance properties are. Okay, so again, the instance properties out here are only going to change this one single wall. Anything inside the type properties here is going to change every single wall of that same type. Okay, and it's not important just for walls, it's going to be important for everything that you end up modeling here within Revit. Okay, so enough about the type properties. Okay, but while we have our walls here, we have our two different wall types. Okay, before we get off of walls in general, all right, is if we go to an elevation view. So in this case is I'm going to go to my south elevation, all right, so that way I can kind of see the face of this here. So if I go to south and double click on my elevation, okay, we'll see that we have that wall there. All right, so if we remember with this wall, all right, we have the base constraint set to level 1, so you can see the bottom of it sets itself right on level 1. The top constraint set up to level 2, so it goes all the way up to level 2. Okay, exactly the way that we want it to be. All right, if you kind of zoom in on your wall here, right, with these offsets to kind of visualize them a little more, like the top offset here, if I said I wanted to offset it, 6 inches, right, hit apply, you can see that what that offset does, right, so now that's level 2 and it moves the top of that one 6 inches off of level 2. All right, and the same will go for the bottom one and anything like that. Okay, so again, if you wanted to use that offset value, that's how you can use that. Okay. Now, what I was saying before about why it's important to actually constrain these, right, so the level 1 and level 2, is let's say, you're building, you're going along and you realize, you know what, I want more head space on my bottom floor here, so I want to move level 2 up from 10 feet, we're going to move it to 12 feet, okay? As long as all of your walls on your first floor here, all right, are constrained to level 2, if we click on level 2 here and change this from 10 feet, and we change it, let's say, to 12 feet, and hit enter, you'll notice that the tops of those walls all move with level 2, okay? And so because they're constrained, right, to level 2, the tops of these are always going to move with this level 2, all right? And the same goes for the bottom with level 1. If level 1 ever moves, the bottoms of them are always going to stay the same, okay? So that's kind of the benefit to having these constrained, either the tops or the bottoms, all right, is if for some reason your levels have to move up or down, all right, you don't have to then go through each individual one of these and select it and say, okay, I moved my floor upstairs up a couple feet, now I have to select this wall and change the height of it a couple feet more, okay? Alternately, if you're looking at your top constraint here, and if you remember that originally it was at unconnected, right? But at unconnected is you can go and change this height to whatever you want. So if you wanted to say 20 feet, say 20 feet, right? It could apply, right? This wall is at 20 feet now, and it's not really connected to anything. Okay, as you can go and physically type in 12 feet for this, so that it sits at the right height. But now, if this level changes, right? Let's say I moved it back up again, a couple more. You can see that that wall doesn't move with it. All right, so you would have to go in and select this and change the height of it. Okay. Now, there will be some situations, where you're going to want to leave it unconnected and type in the actual height. For instance, if you have kind of a knee wall that only goes up 3-4 feet, you're going to want to leave it unconnected at 4 feet. But that's kind of a one-off instance. But for the most part, like I mentioned, is you're always going to want to keep it connected to one of the levels you have here. Okay. That way, as these move around, the tops and bottoms of your walls are going to move around as well. Okay. All right. You also notice as I was changing around the settings here for the constraints, right? We were playing around in this box out here, which is the instance properties. And as I was changing those top constraint numbers, right, as you notice that only this one single wall was moving. All right, this was the only one that was changing. That's because they're instance properties, and they only affect this one single instance of the wall. Okay. So again, just kind of reiterating the difference between the instance properties and the type properties. All right. Okay. So for the most part with walls and the basic walls, that's what I wanted to go over so far. Right. next, what we want to go through is we're going to go through windows. All right. Now there are the two other types of walls: the stackable walls and the curtain walls, which we'll get into as well. All right, but we'll kind of get into those at the end of the lecture here. First, we'll go through kind of windows and doors. Okay, so now getting into windows and doors. All right, we'll go ahead and start off with windows. Is before we actually start to place these in our model, is just a quick explanation on windows and doors and kind of what kind of a family that they are. All right, so with walls, all right, and the same is going to go for floors and ceilings and roofs when we get there. All right, is walls are what's considered to be called a system family. All right, in Revit, a system family is basically, a family that gets built here inside of your project. So where we're making walls and different types and building the different layers and things and materials here in the project, right? That's why it's called a system family, right? Because it's kind of built within our project, right? Windows and doors are a little bit different. Is they're called loadable families, right? Because with windows and doors, all right, they're actually built externally from this project, okay? So windows and doors are actually an external file, okay? They're what's called a family file. So you build a window and door family kind of in the Revit family editor. So if you were to open up one of the families for a window or door, it would actually open a completely different file, and you save it, and you load these family files into Revit, right? So it's kind of like embedding these families inside of your project, all right? So they're made kind of externally and then loaded in, which is why they're called loadable families, right? Now there are what are called in-place families. We're not going to get into them today, but we will eventually when we talk about kind of editing and creating our own families, all right? But again, today we're not going to get into them specifically.